Hi, welcome to the Hurricane Utah Adult Religion class, sponsored by the Hurricane Utah North Stake of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Mike Parker, and since 2008, it's been my privilege to be the instructor for this class. The Hurricane Utah Adult Religion class meets on Thursday evenings between September and May to discuss the scriptures, teachings, and history of the restored Church of Jesus Christ. If you live in or are visiting the Hurricane St. George area, I'd love to have you join us. Time and location are available on the class website. There's a link to that in the show notes just below this video. Also on the class website, you can download my notes, which includes footnotes documenting my sources, this PowerPoint presentation, and handouts that I distribute in class. Please note that this YouTube channel and the class website are not official sites of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Hurricane Utah North Stake, or any other church unit or department. I alone am responsible for the content on these sites. What you're about to see is a recording of my notes for one of the lessons. If you enjoy this video, please click the like button and share it with a friend. And please feel free to subscribe if you'd like to be notified when new content is posted to this channel. My friends, the gospel of Jesus Christ is true. Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, and the authority and keys that he held are now vested in the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And most importantly, Jesus Christ is the Son of God and the Savior of the world. I hope you enjoy this lesson. This lesson covers the narratives regarding the prophet Daniel and the prophecies attributed to him. I've prepared a handout for this lesson with a biography of Daniel, the authorship of the book and its historical difficulties, and proposed dates for when it was written, along with a structural outline of the book. There's a link in the show notes to download this handout in PDF format. You can also go to www.huarc.org to download all the handouts, notes, and slideshows from this course. The book of Daniel is both familiar and unfamiliar. Daniel is one of the best known characters in the Bible. The tales of Daniel being cast into the lion's den and his friends being thrown into the fiery furnace are two famous Bible stories taught to children. At the same time, Latter-day Saints tend to overlook much of the book of Daniel. For example, except for the brief passages about the Ancient of Days and the angel Michael, we virtually never discuss the visions that make up the second half of the book. In this lesson, I'm going to try to present an overview of the entire book of Daniel, the stories and the visions. I'll put Daniel into context in the time and place it was written and discuss what its messages mean to us today. The book of Daniel naturally divides into two sections, the 6 narratives in chapters 1 through 6 and the 4 visions in chapters 7 through 12. Like the Torah and the book of Isaiah, the authorship of the book of Daniel is not as straightforward as it may seem. The stories about the boy Daniel and his 3 companions that make up the first half of the book were written in the third person by an anonymous author or authors. The prophecies in the second half were purportedly written by Daniel himself and are in the first person. Dating the composition of the book is also tricky. Tradition ascribes the entire book to Daniel himself, writing sometime in the 6th century BC during the Babylonian captivity. Few people still accept this, though. Arguments for a much later date, around 167 BC, were raised as early as the 3rd century AD. This conclusion was resisted for 1500 years, but has come to be embraced by most biblical scholars since the 18th century. The handout for this lesson examines the reasons for dating the book of Daniel in the 2nd century BC instead of the 6th. We'll touch on these reasons a little later in the lesson. I'd also like to note here that there are numerous and substantive historical errors in the book of Daniel. The author or authors frequently got names and dates wrong, mistook one king for another, and generally didn't have a good grasp on Babylonian and Persian history. Intriguingly, the historical account in Daniel gets much better as the narrative in the vision chapters gets closer to the 2nd century BC, which is one compelling reason to date the book to that time. I'll discuss this later. The stories in Daniel were probably based on oral traditions that were handed down for hundreds of years before being committed to writing. Latter-day Saints accept the Bible as far as it is translated correctly, so we shouldn't be too worried about these issues. The message of the book is more important than its historicity. Regarding the purpose of the narratives in chapters 1 through 6, for hundreds of years, the Israelites had lived in their own land where the law given to Moses was the law of the land, even if they lived it inconsistently. During the Babylonian exile, Jews found themselves strangers in a strange land where the laws were different and the people among whom they lived worshipped many gods. The stories in Daniel were written to explain how Jews should live in a world that is mostly made up of Gentiles. For example, may Jews eat food that has been sacrificed to idols, or should they refuse such foods? See chapter 1. Should they worship the local gods of the lands in which they lived, or should they worship Jehovah exclusively? See chapter 3. What should they do if the worship of Jehovah is banned altogether? Should they observe the law of the land or the law of God? See chapter 6. The first narrative is about Daniel and his 3 friends who were tested at the Babylonian court. The book begins by explaining how Daniel got to Babylon. The Neo-Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II besieged Jerusalem and took the vessels of the temple as plunder, along with young men of Judah who were of nobility, or who were priests, or who had special knowledge or skills. Daniel and his 3 companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were taken to Babylon to serve in the king's court. They were given Babylonian court names and taught the literature and language of Chaldeans for 3 years. Immediately they were put to the test. They refused to eat food and drink wine that had been offered to Babylonian idols. Instead, they agreed to eat only vegetables, what the King James calls pulse, and drink only water for 10 days, after which they asked the Babylonian officer to compare them to the other servants who had eaten the king's food. Daniel's plan succeeded. He and his companions were blessed with health and intelligence, because of which the king made them leading courtiers. Their wisdom and understanding were 10 times better than any of the Babylonian magicians or astrologers. The issue was not the quality of the king's food. It wasn't poisoned, fattening, or high in cholesterol. Rather, it was ritually impure because it had been used as part of the rites of idol worship. In the second narrative, Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the 5-part statue. Textually, something interesting happens in this chapter. In verse 4, after the King James's phrase, in Syriac, the original text switches from Hebrew to Aramaic. It continues in Aramaic until the end of chapter 7, after which it switches back to Hebrew. Aramaic became the common language of the ancient Near East during the Assyrian Empire, and it continued to be so through the Babylonian and Persian eras. While the Jews were in captivity in Babylon, they adopted Aramaic as their language. They continued to use it in daily conversation until after the time of Jesus. Daniel 2, verses 4b through 7, verse 28, and portions of the book of Ezra are the only parts of the Old Testament not written in Hebrew. Although that doesn't help us date when these portions were written, it does demonstrate that they were written after the return from Babylonian exile, when Jews had adopted Aramaic as their common language. In this story, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that troubled him immensely. He summoned his magicians, astrologers, and sorcerers, and demanded that they tell him what he had dreamed and what it meant. They protested that no mortal could do such a thing, only the gods. Thereupon Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and threatened to have them all executed. As wise men of the king's court, Daniel and his friends were to be executed as well. Daniel prayed to know the interpretation, and God revealed the secret to him in a night vision. Daniel praised God, declaring that he controls the rise and fall of kings and reveals deep and secret things. Daniel interpreted the king's dream and ascribed the interpretation to God. Nebuchadnezzar's dream was of a statue made of 5 distinct materials. Each part of the statue represented a kingdom that would succeed the one before it. Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom would be succeeded by 3 other earthly kingdoms, after which God would establish a 5th kingdom that would endure forever. From the perspective of a reader in the 2nd century BC, the gold head would represent the kingdom of Babylon. The silver chest and arms would represent the kingdom of the Medes. The bronze thighs would represent the kingdom of Persia. The iron legs would represent the Macedonian Greek kingdom of Alexander the Great. The feet of clay mixed with iron would represent the Diadochi, the 4 empires that emerged when Alexander's empire disintegrated after his death. One of these kingdoms, the Seleucid Empire, was actively persecuting the Jews around the time that the book of Daniel was probably compiled, circa 167 BC. According to ancient Jewish interpretation, God would overthrow the Seleucids and reestablish his kingdom. This, to them, was the stone cut without hands from the mountain. I'll discuss the history of these kingdoms later in the lesson. Joseph Smith revealed an interpretation of Daniel 2 for our time. The stone cut out of the mountain without hands is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which shall roll forth unto the ends of the earth until it has filled the whole earth. Other church leaders have followed Apostle Parley P. Pratt's proposed explanations for the other symbols in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The gold head represents Babylon. The silver chest and arms represent Medo-Persia. The bronze thighs represent Macedonian Greece. The iron legs represent Rome, which was divided into western and eastern halves. The feet of clay mixed with iron represent the European nations that emerged when the Roman Empire disintegrated. After Daniel told the king what his dream was and interpreted it, King Nebuchadnezzar worshipped him, and Daniel and his friends were promoted. In the third narrative, Daniel's friends were tested in the fiery furnace. Daniel himself does not appear in the story in chapter 3. It appears to be from a separate oral tradition, as it doesn't fit well with the chronology of the book. Nebuchadnezzar had just worshipped Daniel and elevated him and his friends to positions of great authority in his government. Now suddenly the king was willing to kill them out of blind fury because they wouldn't worship his golden image. According to the story, the king erected an enormous golden statue and commanded everyone in his kingdom to bow down and worship it. When Daniel's 3 friends, who are called by their Chaldean names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to worship the statue, the king's officials accused them of treason before the king. The king, in his rage and fury, ordered the 3 men to be put to death in a furnace. They went willingly, trusting God with the outcome. The 3 men were bound and cast into the furnace, which the king ordered stoked to 7 times its normal temperature. It was so hot that the guards who threw the men into the fire died in performance of their duties. But Nebuchadnezzar was confused. He had ordered 3 men thrown into the fire, but he saw 4 men walking about unharmed in the furnace. The King James translators rendered verse 25 incorrectly. Quote, "He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the fourth is like the Son of God." Unquote. The King James translators' theological biases influence their translation. They would have us believe that a polytheistic Babylonian who lived 600 years before Christ explained what he saw in the furnace from the perspective of a New Testament Christian. This passage should be translated, "The fourth is like a son of the gods," or is like a divine being. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar saw a godlike being, an angel or other divine messenger, and believed that it was one of the Babylonian gods that he worshipped. Who was the divine being in the furnace? The passage doesn't say, but the point of the story is that the Lord sent one of his divine servants to protect the three men. Nebuchadnezzar brought Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego out of the fire. They were unharmed and didn't even have the smell of smoke upon them. The king praised their God, issued a proclamation making it a capital offense to blaspheme the God of the Jews, and promoted the three men. The point of the story is that Jews living under foreign domination shouldn't bow down and serve other gods just because the king commands them to, even under penalty of death. If God chose to deliver them from death, then that was his will. If not, then they would die having obeyed the Lord. In the fourth narrative, Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the cosmic tree. This is an unusual story in that it was purportedly written by King Nebuchadnezzar II himself in the form of a proclamation. Several versions of this story circulated in the ancient world. Most likely, it originally referred to the last Babylonian king, Nabonidus, who reigned 556 to 539 BC. The handout for this lesson has more information about this. Like the events of chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar had a terrifying dream that no one could interpret. Daniel was summoned, and the king described the dream to him. In his dream, the king saw a giant tree at the center of the earth that provided fruit for all living creatures to eat. A divine being called a Watcher came down from heaven and commanded that the tree be cut down to a stump and left in chains, and its mind, or heart, changed from that of a man's to that of a beast's. All of this was done to demonstrate that God controls the kingdoms of man. At first, Daniel was afraid to tell the king the interpretation of the dream because it was so dreadful. He then said that King Nebuchadnezzar was the tree, and that he would be cut down to eat with animals. The stump and roots represented what would be left of his kingdom. Only a fragment of it would remain as a reminder that God is in control of human affairs. The dream was soon fulfilled. Nebuchadnezzar boasted of his own greatness and was struck with madness. He went into exile, where he ate grass and lived like a wild man. Only when he confessed the greatness of Daniel's God was he restored to sanity and his throne. In the fifth narrative, Daniel interpreted the writing on the wall at Belshazzar's feast. In the tale, the Babylonian king Belshazzar called a lavish feast. There was drunkenness all around, and the guests even drank from the vessels taken from the Jerusalem temple by Nebuchadnezzar and used them as drink offerings to their idols. Not a good start to things. Just at that moment, the finger of a man's hand miraculously appeared and began writing on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. The king was terrified and called his astrologers, wise men, and diviners, but they were unable to interpret the writing. Naturally, Daniel was then summoned. Daniel refused the king's gifts and reminded him how his father's pride had led to his downfall. He denounced Belshazzar's blasphemous use of the temple vessels, then gave the meaning and interpretation of the writing on the wall. The words written on the wall were Babylonian weights of measure, but they sound like other words in Aramaic. Daniel's interpretation was based on this sound play. A mene is 1 talent, or 60 shekels. In Aramaic, this word sounds like the verb to number. So Daniel's interpretation of this word was, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. A tekal is a shekel. In Aramaic, this word sounds like the verb to weigh. So Daniel interpreted this to mean, you have been weighed in the balance, or scales, and found wanting. Uparsin refers to 2 half pieces, or 2 half shekels. In Aramaic, this word sounds like the verb to divide. It's also a wordplay of the Aramaic word for Persian. Daniel's interpretation was, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. 60 shekels plus 1 shekel plus 2 half shekels equals 62, which happens to be the age of Darius the Mede, who supplanted Belshazzar, according to the account at the end of chapter 5. Surprisingly, Belshazzar didn't have Daniel put to death for prophesying the end of his reign. Instead, he made him third in command of his kingdom. That very night, though, Daniel's interpretation of the writing came to pass. Belshazzar died, and the Babylonian kingdom was overthrown. The 6th and final narrative is the famous story of Daniel in the lion's den. The next story took place during the reign of Darius the Mede, who retained Daniel as one of his top 3 ministers. In fact, Daniel was the best of all the king's officials. Jealousy set in, and the other officials plotted against Daniel. They set him up by getting the king to sign an edict requiring that all prayers be directed to the king for an entire month on penalty of death. Daniel continued to pray to God 3 times each day, and he was caught and indicted before the king. King Darius was unwilling to have Daniel put to death, but he allowed the sentence to be carried out. Daniel was thrown into a den of lions, and a stone was rolled over the opening. The king expressed faith that Daniel's God would deliver him, and he spent the night in sleepless fasting. At dawn, Darius rushed to the lion's den to learn what had become of Daniel. Darius found him alive and well, and Daniel reported that an angel had preserved him. Darius threw Daniel's accusers and their families to the lions and issued an edict praising Daniel's God. The second half of the book of Daniel is dark and mysterious. It presents 4 apocalyptic visions allegedly received by Daniel, in which he saw divine beings and figures of strange beasts. He was told of the history of the world and of a climactic battle between good and evil that would be followed by God's final judgment. Because the symbols in Daniel and other apocalyptic books from the Old Testament era are so difficult to interpret, Jewish and Christian theologians have embraced different schools of interpretation. There are 4 major perspectives. In the preterist view, the visions in Daniel referred to events that took place at the time the book was written. The historicist interpretation argues that the visions in Daniel referred to events that were still in the future when the book was written, but many or most of them have already been fulfilled. Holders of the futurist interpretation believe the visions in Daniel refer to events that are still in our future. Idealists hold that the visions in Daniel don't refer to actual events. Rather, they symbolize the ongoing conflict between good and evil, light and darkness, and truth and error that exists in all times. Many Latter-day Saints take a futurist approach to Daniel's visions. But while some of the symbols may have future application, I'm going to argue that Daniel 7 through 12 is best understood from a preterist perspective. These visions were not written by the historical individual Daniel in the 6th century BC. They were written 400 years later and ascribed to Daniel. To understand how this happened, we need to cover some additional Jewish history. I've previously discussed the fall of the Assyrians to the Babylonians in 609 BC. The Achaemenid Persians from the east conquered the Median Empire in 550 BC. They conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire 11 years later in 539. The Persians continued to dominate the entire ancient Near East for the next 200 years. The Achaemenid king Cyrus II freed the Jewish exiles held captive in Babylon, and many of them returned to Judah and rebuilt the temple. I'll discuss that next week. The nation of Judah enjoyed a significant amount of autonomy under Persian rule. 200 years later, the Macedonian Greek ruler Alexander III single-handedly conquered the entire Persian Empire, including Egypt, the Fertile Crescent, and Persia itself. He accomplished this feat in only 5 years, between 336 and 331 BC, earning himself the title Alexander the Great. The following maps show Alexander's conquests by year. Alexander's conquests had an enormous impact on the ancient Near East. Greek language, learning, and culture flooded the area. Even Jews adopted the Greek language and translated the scriptures into Greek, a work called the Septuagint. Alexander died suddenly and unexpectedly in 323 BC, without leaving a clear line of succession. His empire disintegrated into 4 smaller kingdoms known as the Diadochi. For the next 300 years, these kingdoms fought among themselves for control of the Near East. At first, Judah was ruled by the Greek-speaking kingdom of the Ptolemies of Egypt. The Ptolemies respected the Jews' practice of their own religion and culture and took a hands-off approach to governing the kingdom of Judah. That changed in 198 BC when Judah came under control of the Greek Seleucid Empire of Syria. The Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV reigned from 175 to 164 BC. He was one of the worst despots in Jewish history. He assumed the title Epiphanes, God Manifest, which declared that he was a god who had come to earth. He was erratic, capricious, and violent. Many scholars believe that he was, in fact, insane. Antiochus forced Greek culture and religious practices upon the Jews. He opened a Greek gymnasium in Jerusalem and forbade circumcision. He forced Jews to eat pork and other foods forbidden by the law of Moses. He required the worship of Greek gods under the threat of death. Most offensive of all, he erected an altar to the god Zeus in the temple at Jerusalem, on which were sacrificed pigs and other unclean animals. This blasphemy was called the Abomination of Desolation. Many elite and wealthy Jews accepted Antiochus's attempts to Hellenize the kingdom of Judah, but a group of insurgents called the Maccabees led a rebellion that succeeded in defeating the Seleucid army and expelling them from Judah in 165 BC. The stories in the first 6 chapters of Daniel were probably compiled around this time, with the intent of encouraging Jews living under the despotic rule of Antiochus to worship Jehovah and obey his law. The stories in the book of Daniel taught that kings are not gods, that the Lord's prophets are superior in wisdom and insight to the kings of the world, and that the Lord honors those who are faithful to him, even if they are martyred for their beliefs. The visions in the second half of Daniel are likely prophecies against Antiochus himself. As we'll see, the symbolism and allegories in the visions refer to a tyrant who would be overthrown, and they unmistakably describe Antiochus. In the first vision, Daniel saw 4 beasts emerging from the sea. These beasts and their features mirror the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. The lion had the wings of an eagle, which were plucked off. It was made to stand upright and given the mind of a man. This symbol corresponds with the gold head in Nebuchadnezzar's dream and represented Babylon. The bear had 3 ribs in its mouth. It was told to arise and eat much flesh. Like the silver chest and arms of the statue, it represented the kingdom of the Medes. The leopard had 4 wings and 4 heads. It was given dominion. Like the bronze thighs, it represented Persia. The dreadful beast had iron teeth and 10 horns. It devoured, crushed, and stamped. Like the statue's iron legs, it represented the Macedonian Greek kingdom of Alexander the Great. The 10 horns of the 4th beast were like the 10 toes made of clay mixed with iron. This was the Diadochi, the kingdoms that emerged when Alexander's empire disintegrated. The 4th beast's little horn uprooted 3 of the older horns. It had a man's eyes and spoke arrogantly. This was the Seleucid Empire under Antiochus IV. Although the meanings of the beasts are not as evident as were the parts of the statue in chapter 2, the connection of the visions of the beasts to Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream are evident. This passage established the context for the rest of the vision. It was about the Jewish struggle against Antiochus and the Seleucids in the 2nd century BC. After the vision of the beasts, Daniel saw a divine figure dressed in white who was sitting on a wheeled throne of fire and holding court with countless attendants. Daniel called him Atik Yomin, the Ancient of Days. Daniel's description of the Ancient of Days is identical to other visions of God on his throne we've seen before in the Old Testament. Now, I know what you're thinking. Stay with me for a moment. Daniel saw God seated on a fiery throne, surrounded by his heavenly council. The books, referring to scrolls, were opened, and from them God judged the terrible beast with the 10 horns and found it guilty. He ordered it to be killed and its body burned. As he did with other Old Testament passages, Joseph Smith took the vision in Daniel 7 and used it in the new context of a revelation he had about a great Latter-day Council that will be presided over by Adam, the first man. In the summer of 1839, the prophet Joseph taught, quote, Daniel chapter 7 speaks of the Ancient of Days. He means the oldest man, our father Adam, Michael. He will call his children together and hold a council with them to prepare them for the coming of the Son of Man. He, Adam, is the father of the human family and presides over the spirits of all men, and all that have had the keys must stand before him in this grand council. The Son of Man stands before him, and there is given him glory and dominion. Adam delivers up his stewardship to Christ, that which was delivered to him as holding the keys of the universe, but retains his standing as head of the human family. Unquote. Next in Daniel's vision, the other 3 beasts, the lion, the bear, and the leopard, meaning the kingdoms they represented, were destroyed. Their dominion was given to Kebar Enosh, one like a son of man, who was brought before the Ancient of Days and given, quote, dominion and glory and a kingdom that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. Unquote. The term Son of Man has been used before in the Old Testament, but up until now, it's always meant a human being. In Daniel, though, it takes on the new meaning of a divine personage who is like a human being. By the time of the New Testament, the expression Son of Man was directly connected to the Messiah, and New Testament authors used that term 87 times to refer to Jesus Christ. Daniel was alarmed by this vision, so he approached one of the divine attendants around God's throne and asked him to interpret the dream. The attendant told him that the beast represented 4 kings, and that the saints, or holy ones, of the Most High will take their kingdoms away and possess them forever. The attendant further explained that the little horn of the 4th beast that had eyes and spoke arrogantly was a king who would tread the earth, devour it, and make war with the holy ones for a time and times and the dividing of time, which is 3.5 times or years. After the 3.5 years, this king will be destroyed, and the kingdom of the Most High will be established. The little horn was probably intended to represent Antiochus IV, who persecuted Judah for 3.5 years, from 167 BC until his death in 164. These images, the Ancient One sitting on the fiery throne, the Son of Man brought before him, the strange beasts, the arrogant horned beast, the great judgment, and the complex numerology, they were all reused and reworked extensively by John in the New Testament book of Revelation. In Daniel's next vision, he saw a ram, a male sheep, with 2 horns that charged west, north, and south. He then saw a male goat with 1 large horn that charged the ram, broke its horns, and trampled it to death. The goat grew immensely powerful, but at the height of its power, its 1 large horn was broken. In its place grew 4 other horns. From one of the 4 horns grew a little horn that was arrogant, attacked heaven, and put a stop to the daily sacrifice at the temple. Daniel overheard holy ones, divine beings, or saints, discussing how long this was to go on. The answer was 2,300 days, or evenings and mornings, after which the sanctuary of the temple would be restored and cleansed. Daniel still didn't understand, so the angel Gabriel was called upon to interpret for him. Gabriel told him that the vision referred to the time of the end, or the end of time. The meanings of these symbols are readily understood when considered in the context of Nebuchadnezzar's statue and the previous vision of the 4 beasts. The ram represented the kings of Persia and Media. The goat with 1 horn represented Alexander the Great's Macedonian Greek Empire. This horn was broken when Alexander died suddenly in 323 BC. The 4 horns that replaced the broken horn were the 4 nations of the Diadochi that succeeded Alexander's kingdom. The arrogant little horn that grew from the 4th horn was a destructive, cunning king who would resist God, the Seleucid king Antiochus IV. The vision concluded with the promise that he shall be broken without human hand. Daniel still didn't understand the vision, so Gabriel told him to keep it a secret. Daniel lay sick for many days. In the 3rd vision, Daniel reinterpreted Jeremiah's prophecy of 70 years. To understand this vision, we need to be familiar with Jeremiah 25, verses 11 and 12. From the King James Version, quote, "And this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And it shall come to pass, when 70 years are accomplished, that I will punish the king of Babylon, and that nation, saith the Lord, for their iniquity, and the land of the Chaldeans, and will make it perpetual desolations." Unquote. Jeremiah had prophesied that after 70 years, the Lord would make the land of Babylon a perpetual desolation, or everlasting waste. If we assume the counting began from when King Nebuchadnezzar II came to the throne in 605 BC, Then the overthrow of Babylon by the Persians in 539 BC came 66 years later. The number 70 has symbolic meaning in Hebrew scripture, so we're going to round it off here and call it good. The problem is that the land of Babylon was not made a perpetual desolation. It was conquered by the Persians in 539 and then by the Macedonians in 331, but it continued to be inhabited up through the 2nd century BC and beyond, and it remains so to this day. To Jews in the Persian or Greek periods, this may have appeared as a failed prophecy. Daniel chapter 9 attempted to deal with this problem. The vision began with a lengthy prayer by Daniel, in which he confessed Israel's sins and violations of the Lord's covenant. He prayed for forgiveness and restoration. The angel Gabriel was sent to answer Daniel's prayer. He told Daniel the following. Daniel 9, verses 24 through 27, English Standard Version, quote, 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem, to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out upon the desolator. Unquote. Are you clear so far? This passage is a challenging one. What in the world does it mean? In Daniel's prophecy, days represent years. Therefore, 1 week equals 7 years. The entire prophecy covers a span of 70 weeks of 7 days each, which is 490 years. 70 times 7 is 490. The prophecy is in 3 parts. The first part lasted 7 weeks, or 49 years, 7 times 7, from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince. The going out of the word referred to when the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. It's probably aimed at the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians in 587. If so, the anointed one, a prince, who came 49 years later, would be the Persian king Cyrus II, who conquered Babylon in 539. 587 plus 49 years is 538 BC, which is close enough. The second part lasted 62 weeks, or 434 years, 62 times 7, during which the temple in Jerusalem was rebuilt in a troubled time. If we interpret the chronology literally, this part of the prophecy would run from 539 to 106 BC, which is 65 years too late. Either the writer miscalculated the number of years, or he was not being strictly literal. The 62 weeks must end in 171 BC, 368 years, because it's at that point that an anointed one shall be cut off, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary as a flood. The anointed one was probably the temple high priest Onias III, who was murdered in 171. The people of the prince who is come would be the Seleucid army of Antiochus IV. The third and final part lasted 1 week, or 7 years, 1 times 7, during which time the prince would make a strong covenant with many. For half of the week, or 3.5 years, he would put an end to sacrifice and offering and establish the abomination of desolation. This period would last until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. This is the period of 171 to 164 BC. During this time, Antiochus IV tried to Hellenize the people of Judah, and most Jews adopted Greek customs. It's in this sense that he made a strong covenant with many Jews. For 3.5 years, 168 to 165 BC, the temple was desecrated and offerings were made to Zeus on its altar, the abomination of desolation. This ended when Maccabean Jewish insurgents drove out the Seleucids and cleansed the temple. Like chapters 7 and 8, chapter 9 is a prophecy of events that were fulfilled in the 2nd century BC. The final vision spans the last 3 chapters of the book of Daniel. This is the longest and most detailed of the 4 visions. It concerns a great conflict. This prophecy is notable because the history that it describes is correct in exacting detail, but only up to a certain point. After that, the events it foretold failed to happen. The conclusion of the book was amended to try to push the date of the prophecy's fulfillment out a little more, but eventually the writer, or writers, gave up when it didn't come to pass. This is yet more evidence that the last half of Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC, as the events themselves were taking place. The vision began with Daniel engaged in a prolonged period of mourning and fasting, after which he saw a vision of an unnamed angel. The angel apologized for being delayed and told him that he had now come to help you understand what is to happen to your people at the end of days. The angel strengthened Daniel so that he could see and understand the vision. Daniel was then shown a long, detailed history of the wars between the kings of the north and the kings of the south. He was first told of the rise of a warrior king of Greece, whose kingdom would be broken and divided into 4 parts. This corresponds with Alexander the Great and the Diadochi. Next, the kings of the south and the kings of the north would battle against each other. The Ptolemies of Egypt fought the Seleucids of Syria in a series of 6 wars between 274 and 168 BC. Eventually, there would come a king of the north who was described as a vile or contemptible person who would practice deceit. This king would profane the temple, set up the abomination of desolation within it, and make himself a god. As we've seen repeatedly, this was Antiochus IV. So far, so good. Up to this point, the predictions correspond with known events in history. Daniel's prophecies of events after this didn't come to pass, though. According to the vision, the king of the north, presumably Antiochus IV, would attack and plunder Egypt. He would then receive alarming reports from the east and the north, whereupon he would return to do battle. He would camp between the seas, the Mediterranean and Dead Seas, facing the glorious holy mountain, the Jerusalem temple, where he would be defeated and killed. At this point, Michael, the Prince of God, would appear and rescue the people of Judah who followed the Lord. Many people would be resurrected, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt, after which the wise would live forever. Daniel was then told to keep the book sealed until the time of the end. Daniel asked how long it would be until these things were fulfilled, and he was told time, times, and a half, 3.5 years, or 1,260 days. Daniel still didn't understand, so he was told to go his way and not worry about it. The prophecy wasn't fulfilled after 1,260 days, and it seems that one or more scribes tried to deal with this problem by tacking on postscripts to the vision. The first edition says the time was really 1,290 days. A second edition drew it out further to 1,335 days. Finally, the reader was told, "Go thy way till the end be." In other words, the end will come eventually, so don't worry about the timing of it. Regardless of the failure of the prophetic timeline, there are true doctrines in the final chapters of Daniel. It contains the first mention in Scripture of the Archangel Michael, Israel's guardian angel and the revealer of secrets, whom we later learn disputed with Satan over the body of Moses and led the angels of God in the war in heaven. Joseph Smith revealed that Michael is Adam, the father of all, the prince of all, who will signal the beginning of the resurrection and who holds the keys of salvation under the counsel and direction of the Holy One. Just as he led the forces of God in the war in heaven, so will he lead them in the final battle between good and evil. Daniel 12 also contains the only explicit mention and description of the resurrection in the Old Testament. Unlike dispensationalist Christians, leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have never tried to incorporate the second half of the book of Daniel into our eschatology, the theology of the end times. Outside of its mention of the Ancient of Days, Daniel chapters 7 through 12 don't play a role in our beliefs about the last days and the second coming of Christ. If these chapters contain prophecies that failed to come true in the 2nd century BC, this would have no effect on our view of the authority of the Bible. That concludes this lesson. If you enjoyed it, please click the thumbs up button and leave a comment below. Please subscribe if you'd like to be notified when new lessons are posted to this channel, and visit www.huarc.org to download these notes, the handout for this lesson, and this slideshow. In the next lesson, I'll back up and discuss what happened to the people of Judah after they were freed from exile in Babylon. The reading is the Old Testament books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. See you next time.